The sun was dropping behind Houston's skyline when Alexander Reed's armored SUV turned into the long, quiet driveway of his River Oaks home, hours earlier than anyone expected. The fountain out front kept spilling water into perfect marble, like the house itself never allowed a single thing out of place. Inside, the air felt colder than the Texas evening. No laughter, no footsteps, no music, just the soft hum of security cameras and a hallway so polished it could have been a museum. Alexander set his briefcase down and took one step forward, then froze. A voice, clear and steady, filled the space as if it came from the walls and the ceiling and his own chest at the same time. Jesus is here. Believe, and you will see. Before he could breathe again, a child's voice called from the back room, stronger than it had ever sounded. Dad, is that you? Before we go on, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is in your city, because stories like this bring people together in ways we can't explain. And if you want more true-to-the-heart faith stories that remind you you're not alone, subscribe to Heaven Walks with Us and stay with us to the very end. Alexander Reed had built his life the way he built his deals. Tight, clean, controlled. The kind of man who didn't hope. He planned. He predicted. He dominated the numbers until they obeyed. In downtown boardrooms, his name carried weight. In private jets, people laughed a little too loudly at his jokes. In glossy business magazines, he was praised as a self-made miracle. But inside that River Oaks mansion, none of it could warm the rooms. The house was stunning. Towering windows, imported stone, a staircase that curved like a sculpture. Yet it didn't feel like a home. It felt like a showroom where everyone spoke softly, as if joy might break something expensive. Grace Reed tried to bring life into it anyway. She arranged fresh flowers every morning. She cooked meals even when she knew Alexander would take a call instead of sitting down. She spoke gently, moved gently, loved gently, like someone tending a candle in a drafty room. And then there was Ethan, 9 years old, bright eyes, quick smile that came and went like a shy sunrise. A wheelchair that had become part of his childhood the way playgrounds became part of other kids' lives. The doctors had explained his condition in careful language and heavy pauses, and the conclusion always landed the same. Therapies could help, progress could happen, but walking on his own was not something anyone promised. Grace never stopped believing anyway. She didn't put on a show about it. She didn't lecture. She just prayed, quietly, consistently, sometimes in a small corner of the house where she kept a simple wooden cross and a worn Bible, sometimes in the passenger seat of the car, sometimes in the hospital parking lot after another appointment ended with the same polite words. Alexander hated that part of her, not because he didn't love her. He did, in his own way. But faith made him uncomfortable. Faith was something you couldn't audit. You couldn't negotiate it into a contract. You couldn't prove it with quarterly reports. To him, prayer felt like surrender, and surrender was weakness. So he stayed busy. He left before Ethan woke up. He came home after Ethan fell asleep. And when Ethan asked, "Will you play with me tonight?" Alexander usually answered without looking up from his phone. "Soon, buddy, soon." But soon never arrived. That evening, though, something had pulled him home early, something that felt like pressure behind the ribs, a restlessness he couldn't buy off, a silence in his mind that his usual routines couldn't fill. And now, standing in that hallway, hearing a voice he couldn't explain. Alexander Reed felt the first crack in the world he thought he controlled. Grace Reed had learned to live in the quiet spaces of the house, not because she liked the silence, but because it was where her faith could breathe. While Alexander built empires with glass walls and sharp edges, Grace built something invisible, fragile, and persistent. She built hope in small, unnoticed moments. Every morning, after helping Ethan get dressed, she wheeled him toward the wide window that faced the garden. Sunlight spilled across the floor in soft patterns, and Ethan liked to imagine that if he stared long enough, his legs would feel warmer. "Mom," he asked one morning, his voice careful, "do you think God knows my name?" Grace knelt beside him without hesitation. She didn't rush the answer. She never rushed things that mattered. "He knows your name," she said gently. "He knows your thoughts. And he knows what you feel when you try to be brave." Ethan looked down at his legs, small hands resting on his knees. "Then why can't I walk?" Grace swallowed. She had asked that same question 1,000 times. In hospital corridors, in parked cars, in the quiet after midnight, when the world finally stopped demanding strength from her. "I don't know why," she admitted softly, "but I know this. Jesus doesn't waste pain, and he doesn't forget anyone." Ethan nodded, as if storing the answer somewhere safe inside him. Later that afternoon, while Ethan napped, Grace slipped into the small prayer corner she had carved out behind the staircase. It wasn't impressive. A wooden cross, a candle, a Bible whose pages were bent and worn from years of turning. She lit the candle and closed her eyes. She didn't ask for wealth, or comfort, or even certainty. She asked for presence. "Give him a father who sees him," she whispered. "And if you will, give my son strength." She knew Alexander didn't believe. He had told her more than once, sometimes sharply, sometimes with tired frustration. "Faith doesn't change outcomes, Grace. Medicine does." And she never argued back. Not because she agreed, but because she understood fear when she heard it. Alexander wasn't cruel. He was afraid. Afraid that if he hoped, and hope failed, the fall would be unbearable. Afraid that if he believed, and nothing happened, he would have no defense left. Grace carried that truth quietly, the way she carried Ethan from his chair to his bed, the way she carried disappointment without letting it harden her heart. That evening, as the house settled into its familiar stillness, Grace heard the front door open much earlier than usual. Alexander was home. She felt it before she saw him, a shift in the air, like the moment before a storm breaks. She stood in the hallway, heart steady but alert, unaware that something unseen had already begun moving through the house, something neither money nor logic could stop. The doctors had always spoken in careful sentences. They chose words the way people choose steps on thin ice, slowly, deliberately, without promises. The Texas Medical Center was filled with glass corridors and quiet confidence, a place where everything looked possible until it wasn't. Alexander Reed liked hospitals, not for what they represented, but for how they operated. Systems, protocols, data, white coats backed by charts and probabilities. This was a world he understood. Grace sat beside him in the consultation room, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on Ethan's shoes as they rested motionless against the foot of the wheelchair. The neurologist, a man with silver hair and a voice worn smooth by decades of bad news, cleared his throat. "Ethan has made progress in strength and coordination," he said evenly. "Therapy helps. It always does." Alexander leaned forward. "But," the pause came right on time. "But we need to be realistic," the doctor continued. "There is no medical pathway that guarantees independent walking. We focus on quality of life, mobility aids, long-term adaptation." Grace felt the words settle like stones in her chest. She reached for Ethan's hand, feeling his small fingers tighten around hers. Alexander nodded, already building mental walls. "So we continue therapy, specialists, whatever it takes." "Yes," the doctor replied gently. "But I wouldn't encourage expectations beyond that." On the drive home, the city blurred past the windows. Grace stared out, silently praying. Alexander stared straight ahead, jaw set, hands tight on the steering wheel. At a red light, Ethan broke the silence. "Dad," he asked quietly, "will I ever play soccer?" The question struck harder than any diagnosis. Alexander exhaled sharply. "There are other things you'll be good at, buddy. You're smart. You'll have a great life." Ethan nodded, but his eyes drifted away. Grace said nothing. She knew better than to rush into moments like this. Words, when forced, often do more harm than good. That night, Alexander poured himself a drink and stood alone in his office, staring at the city lights. He told himself he was doing everything right. The best doctors, the best facilities, unlimited resources. And yet, nothing moved. Not Ethan's legs, not the fear lodged deep in his chest. Down the hall, Grace tucked Ethan into bed. She brushed his hair back and kissed his forehead. "Mom," he whispered, "do you think Jesus can hear me here, or only at church?" Grace smiled through the ache in her throat. "Everywhere," she said, "especially when you're honest." After she turned off the light, she knelt beside his bed for a long time, praying without words. Meanwhile, Alexander stood in his office, staring at his reflection in the dark glass. Successful, powerful, and utterly helpless. He didn't know it yet, but that certainty he clung to, that medicine had spoken the final word, was about to be challenged in a way no boardroom ever could. The deal in New York had fallen apart without warning. What was supposed to be a routine flight back from a failed negotiation turned into hours of silence for Alexander Reed. He sat in the back of the plane, staring at figures on his tablet that no longer made sense. Numbers that usually obeyed him now felt hollow, meaningless. For the first time in years, his phone stayed quiet. No assistants calling. No partners demanding updates. Just the low hum of the engines and a strange pressure in his chest he couldn't shake. It wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It felt more like urgency. As soon as the plane touched down in Houston, Alexander made a decision that surprised even him. "Take me home," he told the driver. "Now." The SUV rolled through the familiar streets of River Oaks as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in muted golds and purples. Normally, at this hour, Alexander would still be in a glass-walled office or seated at a restaurant table discussing margins and timelines. But tonight, something pulled him back. When the gates opened and the car eased into the driveway, Alexander noticed how quiet everything felt. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that presses against the ears. Inside, the house greeted him the same way it always did, immaculate, orderly, lifeless. He set his briefcase down on the marble table and loosened his tie. The air smelled faintly of incense. That caught his attention. Grace must have been praying again. He took a step forward. Then he stopped. The voice came without warning. Not loud, not threatening, clear, steady, certain. "Jesus is here. Believe, and you will see." Alexander's heart slammed against his ribs. He turned sharply, scanning the hallway. "Grace?" he called out, his voice tighter than he intended. No answer. The security monitors showed nothing unusual. The doors were locked. The staff had already left for the evening. Every logical explanation lined up neatly, and yet none of them fit. He stood there, frozen, listening. The silence returned, heavier than before. For a moment, Alexander laughed under his breath, trying to reclaim control. Fatigue, stress, a mind stretched too thin. That's all this was. Then he heard it. "Dad?" The voice came from the far end of the house. Ethan's voice. It sounded different, clearer, stronger. Alexander's pulse spiked as he started down the hallway. Each step felt louder than the last, echoing against the polished floors. He didn't know what he expected to find, only that something had shifted, and once shifted, it could not be undone. As he reached the partially open door to Ethan's room, he hesitated. Whatever waited on the other side would demand something from him. Not money, not solutions, belief. And Alexander Reed had never learned how to give that. Alexander pushed the door open slowly. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of a bedside lamp. Ethan sat upright on the bed, his small hands resting together in his lap, as if he'd been waiting. Grace was kneeling beside him, her head bowed, lips moving in a whisper so quiet it barely disturbed the air. "Grace?" Alexander said. She looked up, startled, then relieved. "You're home early." He didn't answer. His eyes stayed fixed on Ethan. The boy's face looked different, not excited, not afraid, focused, as if he were listening to something no one else could hear. "Dad," Ethan said gently, "did you hear him too?" Alexander felt a chill crawl up his spine. "Hear who?" Ethan smiled, small but certain. "Jesus." Grace's breath caught. She turned toward her son, searching his face. Ethan, what do you mean, sweetheart? He told me not to be scared, the boy continued. He said he's here, and that if we believe, things will change. Alexander took a step back, instinctively. This isn't funny, he said, his voice sharp. Ethan, you shouldn't say things like that. I'm not joking, Ethan replied, still calm. I heard him, just like I hear you. The room felt suddenly smaller, the walls pressing in. Alexander's mind raced for explanations. Suggestion, imagination, something Grace had said earlier. Anything that kept this grounded in reality. Grace stood up slowly. Her hands trembled, but her voice didn't. When did this happen? Just now, Ethan said. When Dad came home. Alexander's stomach tightened. He remembered the voice in the hallway. The exact same words. Jesus is here. He rubbed his temples. Grace, this isn't healthy. We can't let him. Dad, Ethan interrupted softly. Something else happened. Alexander looked at him sharply. What? Ethan glanced down at his legs. For a moment, nothing happened. Then his brow furrowed in concentration. His hands gripped the edge of the mattress. I felt something, he whispered. Like warmth. Grace's eyes widened. Ethan! Before either adult could react, the boy's right foot twitched. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it happened again. Grace dropped to her knees. Alexander's breath hitched. That's probably a reflex, he said quickly. Muscle memory. Spasms happen. But even as he spoke, Ethan's toes curled, slowly, deliberately. I did it, the boy said, wonder filling his voice. Dad, I did it. Silence swallowed the room. Alexander stared at his son's feet, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. Logic screamed for control, for distance, for reason. But another part of him, small, buried, long ignored, whispered a terrifying possibility. What if this wasn't something he could explain away? What if the voice was telling the truth? For several seconds, no one spoke. Grace was the first to move. She reached for Ethan's legs as if afraid the moment might disappear if she didn't hold it in place. Her hands hovered, trembling, careful not to startle him. Ethan, she whispered, barely daring to breathe. Try again. The boy closed his eyes. His face tightened with effort. His small shoulders rose as if his entire body were helping his legs remember something they had never done before. Nothing happened. Alexander released a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. See? He said quickly. That's exactly what I mean. Muscles fire randomly. It doesn't. Ethan tried again. This time, both feet moved. Just slightly, but deliberately. Grace let out a quiet sob and pressed her hand to her mouth. Oh my God! Alexander felt his knees weaken. He reached for the edge of the dresser to steady himself. No, he muttered. This doesn't make sense. Ethan opened his eyes, searching his father's face. Dad, did I really do it? Alexander swallowed hard. Every instinct told him to shut this down before it grew too large, too fragile. It's a reaction, he insisted, though his voice had lost its edge. We'll call the doctor in the morning. But it felt different, Ethan said. Like something woke up. Grace turned toward Alexander, tears streaking her cheeks. This isn't random. You saw it. You heard what he said. Alexander shook his head, pacing the room. People hear things under stress. Children imagine things. And bodies do strange things. Then explain why it happened right after that voice, Grace said quietly. He stopped pacing. The room fell silent again, thick with unspoken fear. I don't want him getting his hopes up, Alexander said at last, softer now. I can't watch him get crushed. Grace stepped closer, her voice steady but unyielding. And I can't watch you crush him by refusing to see what's right in front of you. Ethan looked between them, confused but still glowing with something new, something fragile and alive. That night, Alexander didn't pour himself a drink. He sat alone in his office, the lights off, replaying the image of Ethan's feet moving again and again. He searched medical journals. He read case studies. He tried to find language that could cage what he'd seen. But the words in his head kept returning to the same phrase. Believe and you will see. Down the hall, Grace knelt beside Ethan's bed, thanking God without asking for anything more. She didn't need promises. She had witnessed the beginning. And Ethan fell asleep smiling, convinced without doubt that something real had touched him. Alexander, meanwhile, stared out at the city lights, realizing with growing dread that the world he trusted, the one built on control and certainty, was starting to crack. And once cracked, it would never be the same again. The hospital smelled the same as it always had. Clean, controlled, predictable. Alexander found comfort in that. By mid-morning, Ethan was back in a familiar examination room, wires gently attached to his legs, monitors blinking with quiet authority. Doctors spoke in measured tones, nurses moved efficiently, and the chaos of the night before felt almost unreal under fluorescent lights. This is where we get clarity, Alexander said firmly, more to himself than anyone else. Grace sat beside Ethan, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. She didn't argue. She didn't challenge him. She simply watched. The neurologist reviewed the scans slowly, tapping a pen against the tablet. There is activity, he said at last. More than we've seen before. Alexander leaned forward. So it's explainable. The doctor hesitated. Neurological pathways can sometimes respond unexpectedly, especially in children. The brain compensates. Grace's heart raced. Does that mean he could walk? The doctor chose his words carefully. It means something has changed, but it does not mean we can promise anything. Alexander exhaled, relief flooding his chest. You hear that? Change happens. Progress happens. Medicine works. Ethan looked up, confused. But I heard Jesus, he said softly. He told me not to be scared. The room went still. The doctor cleared his throat. Children often interpret experiences symbolically, he said gently. What matters is that Ethan feels encouraged. Encouraged. The word felt small. On the drive home, Alexander spoke with renewed confidence. We'll increase therapy sessions. Bring in another specialist if needed. This isn't a miracle, it's progress. Grace turned toward the window, watching the city slide by. And if it's both? She asked quietly. He didn't answer. That afternoon, the calls began. Partners, advisors, colleagues. Someone had heard about Ethan's miracle, and the tone was unmistakable. Curious, amused, dismissive. People are talking, one of them laughed over the phone. Did your wife start believing in healings now? Alexander forced a chuckle. Nonsense. It's neurological improvement. Doctors confirmed it. He hung up and sat alone, anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. That evening, Ethan tried to move his legs again. They responded. Not much, but enough. Grace gasped softly, covering her mouth. Thank you, she whispered. Alexander watched from the doorway, his chest tight. Every movement pulled him in two directions, one towards certainty, the other towards something dangerous. Hope. Later that night, Ethan looked up at his father. Dad, if Jesus helped me, does that mean he wants to help you too? Alexander felt something twist deep inside him. He opened his mouth to answer, but for the first time in his life, logic failed him completely. The room was filled with glass, steel, and laughter that came a little too easily. Alexander sat at the long conference table in a private lounge overlooking downtown Houston. Jackets were off. Drinks were poured. Deals were discussed with casual confidence. The kind of confidence that came from believing the world always rewarded the strongest voice in the room. Reed, one of the partners said with a grin, swirling the ice in his glass. I heard something interesting. Alexander didn't look up. If it's about projections, send it to my office. No, the man chuckled. About your son. The laughter around the table softened, but it didn't disappear. Apparently he's walking now, another added, eyebrows raised. What happened? New experimental treatment? Someone else leaned back in their chair. Or did Grace take him to one of those healing prayer things? The table erupted in amused murmurs. Alexander felt heat rise in his neck. He forced a smile. Let's keep my family out of business conversations. Relax, the first man said. We're just curious. Miracles make great headlines. Alexander's jaw tightened. There is nothing miraculous about neurological improvement. Doctors confirmed it. Of course, someone said, nodding theatrically. Science. That's why we trust you. Reed, you're not one of those people who believes feelings move markets. More laughter. Alexander laughed too. But it came out wrong. Thin. Hollow. Later, alone in the elevator, the smile vanished. The words echoed louder than he expected. That's why we trust you. Trust, credibility, image, all built on one assumption, that he was a man of reason, control, certainty. At home that night, the contrast was unbearable. Ethan was in the living room, gripping the arms of his chair, concentrating hard. Grace stood close, ready to catch him if he fell. I think I can stand longer today, Ethan said, determination lighting his face. Alexander watched from a distance, heart pounding. Ethan pushed himself up. His legs shook, but they held. Grace covered her mouth, tears spilling freely. You're doing it, she whispered. Alexander felt pride surge, followed immediately by fear, because tomorrow and someone else would hear. Another joke, another raised eyebrow, another question about whether he'd lost his edge. That night, Alexander lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He wasn't afraid of losing money. He was afraid of losing who the world thought he was. And for the first time, he wondered if holding on to that image might cost him something far more valuable than respect. Alexander didn't plan to go anywhere that afternoon. He had left the office early under the excuse of traffic, but instead of driving home, he found himself wandering through an older part of the city, away from glass towers and guarded entrances. The streets were narrower here, the buildings shorter. The air smelled faintly of coffee and rain-soaked stone. He parked the car without knowing why. Across the street stood a small brick church, worn by time and weather. No banners, no crowds. Just a wooden door slightly open, as if the place itself were waiting. Alexander hesitated. This wasn't his world. He adjusted his jacket, glanced around to make sure no one recognized him, then stepped inside. The change was immediate. The noise of the city faded behind him, replaced by stillness. Candles flickered along the walls. Sunlight filtered through stained glass, casting muted colors across the wooden pews. Alexander sat near the back. He didn't pray. He didn't bow his head. He just sat there, hands clasped tightly, staring at the floor as thoughts he'd spent years outrunning finally caught up to him. I don't understand what's happening, he muttered under his breath. And I don't like not understanding, a voice answered from nearby. Most important things begin that way. Alexander looked up sharply. A man stood a few rows ahead, mid-40s, calm eyes, simple clothes beneath a worn clerical collar. He held a small rosary loosely in one hand. I didn't mean to interrupt, the priest said gently, but you look like someone carrying a heavy argument with himself. Alexander exhaled slowly. I'm not religious. The priest nodded. Good. Then we can talk honestly. Something about that disarmed him. They sat in silence for a moment before Alexander spoke again, quietly, unexpectedly. He told him about the voice, about Ethan's legs moving, about the doctors, the laughter, the fear of being wrong. When he finished, he waited for judgment. It didn't come. Instead, the priest said, faith isn't believing because you understand. It's trusting when you don't. Alexander shook his head. I'm afraid of giving my son hope if it's not real. The priest turned toward him fully. Sometimes a child doesn't need certainty. He needs to know his father will stand beside him, whether the miracle comes or not. Those words landed harder than any diagnosis. Alexander stared at the altar, throat tight. And if this changes everything? The priest smiled softly. Then maybe that's the point. Alexander left the church without answers, but for the first time in weeks, he felt something unfamiliar. Not control, but peace, brushing close enough to be felt. The changes didn't come all at once. They came quietly, almost cautiously, as if whatever was happening didn't want to frighten anyone away. Each morning, Ethan tried again. Some days, nothing happened. His legs refused to cooperate, trembling under the weight of effort before giving out. On those days, Grace kissed his forehead and told him it was enough just to try, and Ethan believed her. Other days, something else happened. Alexander began staying home more often, telling his office he was working remotely. In truth, he spent most mornings standing in the hallway outside Ethan's room, watching without letting himself be seen. "Ready?" Grace asked gently one morning. Ethan nodded, gripping the edge of the bed. He pushed down with his arms, muscles straining, face flushed with effort. Alexander held his breath. Ethan's feet touched the floor. They shook violently, but they held. 1 second. 2. "Mom," Ethan whispered, astonished. "I'm standing." Grace's knees buckled as she reached out, steadying him just enough to keep him upright. Tears streamed down her face, but she smiled through them. "You're doing it," she said softly. "You're really doing it." Alexander felt his chest tighten painfully. His instinct was to step forward, to catch his son, to celebrate, but he stayed frozen in the doorway. Because celebration meant acknowledgement, and acknowledgement meant surrender. Ethan managed to stay upright for nearly 10 seconds before collapsing back onto the bed, laughing breathlessly. "Did you see that?" Grace laughed too, covering her mouth, nodding over and over. "I saw everything." Later that afternoon, Alexander finally spoke. "How long did he stand?" he asked, pretending to review emails on his phone. Grace looked up at him, surprised. "Almost 10 seconds. He nodded slowly. "That's significant." That night, Alexander couldn't sleep. He lay awake replaying the scene again and again, the tremor in Ethan's legs, the look of wonder on his face, the way Grace whispered gratitude instead of fear. This wasn't imagination. This wasn't denial. This was happening. The next morning, Ethan surprised them both. "I want to try something," he said. Grace hesitated. "Sweetheart, we should go slow." "I know," he replied, "but I think I can take a step." Alexander's heart pounded as he moved closer, arms outstretched, just in case. Ethan stood, balanced. Then, with everything he had, he shifted his weight forward. His foot slid, just inches, but it moved on purpose. Alexander caught him before he fell. For a brief moment, father and son stood there together, locked in place, and in that instant, Alexander realized something terrifying and beautiful at the same time. The miracle wasn't only happening in Ethan's legs, it was happening in him. The call came just as Alexander was closing Ethan's bedroom door. He glanced at the screen and froze. New York. For weeks, that deal had been dead, buried under delays, shifting numbers, and quiet rejections. Alexander had already begun rewriting his projections, convincing himself it was better to move on. But now, the opportunity had returned. "Alexander," the voice on the other end said briskly, "we're back on. The investors want to move fast. Meetings in Manhattan. 10 days. Alexander straightened instinctively. His mind snapped into familiar alignment. Numbers. Leverage. Expansion. The kind of deal that didn't just restore momentum. It multiplied it. "This could redefine your company," the man continued. "But you'll need to be here in person. No delays." Alexander's gaze drifted down the hallway, toward Ethan's room. "I'll call you back," he said, and ended the call. That evening, he spread documents across his desk. Charts, timelines, forecasts. The deal was everything he had worked toward for years. International reach, unquestioned authority, proof that he hadn't lost his edge. Grace knocked softly and stepped inside. "We need to talk," she said. He didn't look up. "Can it wait?" "No." She closed the door behind her. Ethan's doctor scheduled a full evaluation in 10 days. They want to reassess everything. You need to be there. Alexander finally met her eyes. I can't. That's when the New York meetings are. Grace's face fell, but her voice stayed steady. Then reschedule them. He shook his head. That's not how this works. They won't wait. And your son should, she asked quietly. The words landed like a blow. I'm doing this for our future, Alexander said sharply. For his future? Grace stepped closer. Our future isn't a balance sheet. Alexander, it's happening right now, in that room. Silence filled the space between them. Later, Ethan looked up at his father with cautious hope. Dad, will you come with me to see the doctors? Alexander hesitated, just a second too long. I'll try, he said. Ethan nodded, accepting the answer, but something in his eyes dimmed. That night, Alexander stood alone by the window, Manhattan's skyline glowing in his imagination, while his son's determined steps replayed in his mind. For the first time, success demanded a price he couldn't calculate, and whatever he chose next would reveal who he truly was. The house was unusually quiet the morning the decision had to be made. Alexander sat at his desk, passport and plane tickets laid neatly in front of him. New York, first class, private meetings already scheduled. His phone buzzed repeatedly, messages from partners, reminders, pressure disguised as urgency. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. 10 days had passed faster than he expected. Down the hall, Ethan was getting ready for the hospital appointment. Grace moved carefully around him, helping him put on his shoes, encouraging him as he practiced his standing once more before leaving. Dad? Ethan called out. Are you ready? Alexander didn't answer. He picked up the passport, feeling its weight in his hand. This small booklet had opened doors across the world. It represented everything he had built. Status, control, proof that he had won. He stood up, walked toward the door, then stopped. From the hallway came the sound of Ethan losing his balance. Grace caught him just in time. I'm okay, Ethan said quickly, embarrassed. Uranen. I just need to try again. Alexander watched from a distance as his son straightened himself, breathing hard but refusing to give up. Something inside Alexander cracked. Grace looked up and saw him standing there. She didn't speak. She didn't plead. Her eyes said enough. This appointment matters, she said softly. Not because of the doctors. Because Ethan needs to know you chose him. Alexander felt the truth of it sink in. He glanced back at his desk, at the tickets, at the phone lighting up again. Then he did something he had never done before. He tore the tickets in half. Once, then again. The sound was sharp in the quiet room. Grace covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes. Alexander exhaled, his hands shaking, not with fear, but with release. I'm not going in, he said. I'll stay. Ethan stared at him, disbelief flickering across his face. Really? Alexander knelt in front of him, placing his hands gently on his son's shoulders. I'm right here. Wherever you go, I'm there. Ethan smiled wider than Alexander had ever seen. The phone rang again. Alexander turned it face down. For the first time in his life, he wasn't choosing power. He was choosing presence. And though he didn't fully understand it yet, that choice would change everything that followed. The hospital corridors felt different that morning. Not colder, not warmer, just heavier, like something important was waiting to be named. Ethan sat on the examination table, legs dangling, hands gripping the edge as if anchoring himself to the moment. Grace stood close, one hand resting lightly on his back. Alexander stood a few steps away, arms crossed, not in defense this time, but in restraint. The neurologist reviewed the scans in silence. Too much silence. Then he looked up. I'm going to be very careful with my word, he said, because what we're seeing wasn't expected. Alexander felt his pulse quicken. Ethan's neural responses have increased significantly, the doctor continued. Balance, strength, coordination. These improvements exceed anything we projected in this time frame. Grace's breath caught. What does that mean? It means, the doctor said slowly, that we need to reconsider what's possible. Alexander stared at the screen. He waited for the caveat, the limitation, the fine print. It didn't come. "We can't call this a full recovery," the doctor added, "but we also can't deny the progress. With continued effort, walking independently is no longer off the table." Ethan looked up at his parents, eyes shining. "I told you," he said softly. "I'm getting stronger." Grace knelt and hugged him, tears soaking his shoulder. "You are, sweetheart." Alexander stood frozen. For years, he had trained himself to hear only what could be measured, proven, guaranteed. And yet here it was, something real, undeniable, and still uncontainable by explanation. On the way out, Ethan insisted on trying something. "I want to walk to the elevator," he said. Grace hesitated. "We can wait until—" Alexander stepped forward. "Let him try." Ethan slid off the table and stood. His legs shook violently. Alexander moved closer, ready. Slowly, carefully, Ethan took a step, then another. The nurse nearby covered her mouth. Alexander felt his chest tighten as he instinctively reached out, not to hold Ethan up, but to walk beside him. They reached the elevator together. Inside, Alexander looked down at his son and realized something had changed forever. Not just in Ethan's body, but in his own heart. For the first time, Alexander didn't ask how. He didn't demand why. He simply stood there, present, witnessing something greater than certainty. And for the first time in his life, that was enough. They went to the church on a Sunday morning, not because Alexander suggested it, but because he didn't say no. Grace noticed the difference immediately. There was no tension in his jaw, no restless glances at his phone. When Ethan asked, "Can Dad come with us today?" Alexander simply nodded. "I'll walk with you," he said. The church wasn't large, just a neighborhood parish tucked between brick buildings and old trees. Families filled the pews. Children whispered. Candles flickered softly, their light catching in the stained glass above the altar. Alexander sat stiffly at first, hands folded, eyes forward. This place still felt foreign to him, too quiet, too vulnerable. He had spent his life mastering rooms where power was spoken loudly. Here, no one cared who he was. Grace knelt without hesitation. Ethan followed slowly, carefully lowering himself beside her. Alexander remained seated, watching them both. The priest's voice drifted through the space, calm and unhurried. Words about trust, about surrender, about faith not as proof, but as relationship. Alexander felt his chest tighten. He watched Ethan struggle slightly to adjust his position on the kneeler, refusing help, determined to do it himself. Grace placed a steadying hand on his back, whispering encouragement. Something inside Alexander gave way. He stood. The sound of movement drew a few glances, but he didn't care. He stepped forward, slowly, then lowered himself beside his wife and son. The kneeler pressed hard against his knees. He winced but didn't rise. For a moment, he didn't know what to do. He had no words prepared, no requests rehearsed, so he did the only thing left to him. He bowed his head. "I don't know how to do this," he whispered. "I don't know how to believe the right way." Grace turned toward him, surprised, eyes shining. Alexander swallowed. "But I know I've been wrong about what matters." His voice cracked. He didn't stop it. "I tried to control everything," he continued softly. "I thought strength meant never needing help. But I was afraid to hope." Ethan reached out and took his hand. Alexander closed his eyes. "I don't ask for proof," he said quietly. "I don't ask for guarantees. I just thank you for my son, for this chance." Tears slipped down his face. Grace leaned into him, her forehead resting against his shoulder. In that small space between whispered prayers and quiet breaths, years of distance dissolved. When the service ended, Alexander stood slowly, legs stiff, heart lighter than it had been in decades. He didn't leave with answers, but he left changed. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid of that. They traveled to visit family the following weekend, a modest home outside the city. Old trees, A backyard worn smooth by years of laughter and footsteps. It wasn't the kind of place Alexander used to feel comfortable in, but now it felt grounding. Ethan had been practicing every day. Not perfectly, not gracefully, but faithfully. That afternoon, while relatives gathered around the table, Ethan pushed his wheelchair aside. No announcement, no drama, just quiet determination written across his face. "Dad," he said, his voice steady but small. "Can you stand over there?" Alexander turned. Their eyes met across the room. He took a step forward, then stopped himself, remembering the promise he'd made not to rush, not to take control. "I'm right here," he said softly. "Whenever you're ready." Ethan stood. His legs shook. His hands trembled. Grace clasped her hands tightly at her chest, unable to breathe. One step, then another. The room fell silent. Each movement felt like time itself was slowing down. Every breath, every heartbeat stretched thin with awe. Ethan stumbled slightly, corrected himself, and kept going. Alexander felt tears blur his vision. "Just one more," he whispered, not daring to move. Ethan smiled, wide, unafraid, and took the final step forward. Then he fell into his father's arms. Alexander caught him instinctively, holding him tight against his chest as sobs broke free at last. He didn't try to stop them. He didn't try to explain them. "I told you," Ethan laughed through tears. "Jesus said I could." Alexander pressed his forehead against his son's hair. "You were right," he whispered. "And I was wrong." The room erupted, hands clapping, voices breaking, gratitude spilling out in quiet prayers and gasps. Grace covered her face, overwhelmed, her heart full beyond words. Later that night, as the house settled into peace, Alexander sat beside Ethan's bed. "Thank you for not giving up on me," he said. Ethan smiled sleepily. "You came back, Dad. That's what matters." In the weeks that followed, Alexander's life changed in ways no contract ever had. He delegated. He stepped back. He learned how to be present. He walked beside Ethan during therapy. He listened. He laughed. He prayed. Not perfectly, not loudly, but honestly. And one afternoon, in a quiet park near their home, Ethan let go of his father's hand and ran ahead a few steps before turning back with joy in his eyes. "Look," he called. Alexander watched, heart full, remembering the words that had once frightened him. "Jesus is here. Believe, and you will see." Now he understood. The miracle wasn't just that his son could walk. It was that he had finally learned how to love. Dear friend, stories like this remind us that miracles don't always arrive the way we expect. Sometimes they heal bodies. Sometimes they heal hearts. And sometimes they do both. If this story touched you, take a moment to subscribe to Heaven Walks With Us so you never miss another journey of faith, hope, and transformation. Share this video with someone who might need encouragement today. And don't stop here. Click the video on your screen now for another powerful story that might restore something you thought was lost. Because you are not alone, and grace still walks with us.